Well, we're past the midway point in the college football season here in 2022. How are the Ducks recruiting right now? How is their class ranked so high, even though the volume of recruits hasn't been that numerous? Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time. Once again, for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why, if you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who has done so already. Today's episode brought to you by Sweat Block. If you or someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try Sweat Block. Save 20% with promo code Locked On at sweatblock.com. We were able to find him in his busy dad schedule this week. New father, John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. John, appreciate you making the time in what is, I know, an eventful couple of days. But, I hope this at least serves as a little bit of rest and relaxation, and you can just listen to my voice.
Yeah, this is my peaceful place, right? We're talking football, we're talking recruiting. This is what we know, as opposed to the crash course of fatherhood over the last month. But yeah, glad to be here, to say the least.
And somehow we're already halfway through the season. We're past the midway point officially. And Oregon's class currently sits at number 12 nationally, thanks to a couple of offensive line commitments. Not the guys we've been talking about extensively here on the show. We will get to them, but I want to start big picture, John, and just look at Oregon's class as a whole. 12th in the country right now, right about where I expected this staff to be based on the expectations they set coming in and salvaging the 2022 class. And now they've got a full cycle and just the pedigree recruiters that they have. But compared to some of the other classes, they don't have the highest volume. It's not an incredibly small number, but what do you make of the size of Oregon's 2023 class at this point?
Well, I think it's coming in kind of right on schedule, right? It was a bit of a slow start just from a volume perspective, as you mentioned. And look, when you're a first year staff that is so busy catching up with the end of the 2022 cycle, there's typically a bit of a lull when you do fully turn that page to 2023. And of course, when you're talking Josh Connolly, the end of the 22 cycle stretched longer for Oregon than just about any other program in the country. So when you do finally turn the page, you start to lock in and start to see the volume pick up slowly but surely. And now all of a sudden it's what, about 20 verbal commitments. You're finally hitting some points along the offensive line that have been really the glaring hole for the class, at least from an optics standpoint, how things are viewed. That was the big question mark. Now it is being addressed. 2 verbal commitments in, potentially more along the way there. And the skill position talent has always been strong with this group, and that has only been bolstered as the season kicked off. So I think it's a good group, obviously balanced. You've got the number one player in the country, for goodness sakes, at quarterback. I think that's a great start. You've got one of the hotter prospects in the country on board in wide receiver Jurion Dickey. So all is well at the very top of this thing. And now all of a sudden there's some more depth coming into the class, and you're going to start to see some variance, right? Guys who look like they're day one ready to go, sign them up, get them going, get them in that rotation, and other guys who maybe a year, 2 years from now, we start to hear a little bit more about. And I think that's another good sign of a coaching staff settling in and feeling good about where they're at.
And every class has, or every good class, I should say, has that blend, right, of guys
Yeah.
who come in and make an impact. Look no further than Oregon's 2021 class a year ago, right? Troy Franklin was there, made an impact, but he's taken a big leap forward this year. Whereas Maliki Matavat last year was a regular player. He started week in and week out. You always have that sort of balance. Bassa was a freshman a year ago, played in basically every game, and continues to be just that. But I also want to ask you, John, about the visits situation, because that's where recruiting gets interesting during the season, right? Is
Yeah.
what sort of players are visiting for this particular game? How much does that have an impact? right now for the rest of the season, Oregon still has a handful of home games left, including this Saturday at Autzen Stadium against UCLA. They've got a couple guys coming who are class of 2024 or even beyond, which is just a wild thing to think about, frankly, that his staff has that. It's the nature of recruiting. If you want to be good at it, that's what you have to do. But the only upcoming class visitor they have in this 2022 season left is Roderick Pleasant, and that is scheduled to be in November. Should Oregon expect any others for this recruiting cycle to come on official visits?
I think you're seeing a bit of strategy here from Dan Lanning and company. We saw a big off-season influence from the official visit perspective, right? A lot of June, July visitors, and then we saw some spot visitors for big games during the season. And now I think it's slowing down a little bit on purpose because you're going to get a reshuffling of the board, right? Guys who are still available, guys who are now higher on the board than maybe they were back in those summer months. So good coaching staffs leave a little bit of room from that official visit perspective because you want November visits. You certainly want December visits leading into that early signing period. And then for those who don't sign in December, you want some January visits to get ahead of the February signing day. So I believe there's almost 24 spots available for Oregon to fill with additional official visitors should they push in that regard. It should be worth mentioning that, transfer portal prospects, all those other kids could eventually visit down the line there as well. So there's always a bit of an investment in holding off on having just all your visit spots filled. And I think it's going to be reserved here at the end for the Ducks with top targets. You mentioned Roderick Pleasant. You wonder if you can get a trip out of a Samson Okunlola, a Samuel Mpemba. Can you get some late official visits of elite prospects who are still on the board? I think that's something that is certainly still on the table for the Ducks here down the line, and we'll see. But I do think that there is always some planning, I should say, ahead for schools who wait, schools who are going to wait it out and get kids on campus maybe when the season is over, so they can spend more time with those recruits. And obviously, it lines up with signing day right around the corner there as well. So I do think we'll see more official visitors than just Roderick Pleasant here going forward, but that list is a bit TBD.
Do you expect Oregon's class to grow substantially in size between now and the early signing window and the national signing day in early February, or do you think it's just going to be maybe two or three more guys than the lineup of verbal commitments they have right now?
Yeah, it probably the latter in terms of the class of 23 now with the coaching carousel that is already underway, with the transfer portal itself. All of that can start to skew the numbers and impact those numbers. So there's still so many circumstantial elements that aren't really available for us to judge. But we do know the top targets here down the line for the Ducks. It's about retaining those verbal commitments of Moore and Dickey and some of these other prospects. And then, of course, trying to close on some of those that are still available. So I expect it to be a class at 25 or under. I think that's kind of always the centering number that you look at when it's your first full class. But again, the roster turnover, the portal, all those things can dictate another spot or two opening up, or even somebody who's allowing an opportunity for a late bloomer to maybe claim a spot. So this thing could push into February and potentially beyond, just like we saw last year, of course, with Connolly jumping on board.
Yeah, right now they're at 20 hard commits in the class of 2023. That should go up at least by a couple, as we'll get to a little bit later in the show. They've added a couple guys, though, that have kind of flown under the radar, but still worthy of pointing out. I certainly have my hopes set on one particular name, Mateo. But that is, as we know, a bit of a more drawn out timeline. What is not drawn out is that if you have issues getting sweaty or having body odor, which is a very normal thing, it happens. It's happened to me a number of times. You don't want to wear a cotton shirt because you're worried about it. You have to go check out Sweatblock. Sweatblock was created by a doctor to help with his own excessive sweating. It's doctor created and doctor recommended. John, I hope you've got AC down there in Florida, or else you yourself would probably want to be using some of this product on a regular basis with all the heat and humidity that exists down there in what is the nickname for Florida? Not the Sunshine State. Or is it Florida? Is that Florida? I thought that was
I
California.
mean, California tries to take it from us, but it's definitely Florida.
I
Sunshine.
see. I see. Yeah, I think California maybe takes that crown when you have tropical storms and such going through. But regardless, if you're dealing with heat, you're dealing with sweat, you got to go get Sweat Block. If you or someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try Sweat Block. Save 20% with promo code Locked On at sweatblock.com. Also available on Amazon, as is just about everything else. Recruits, however, not available on Amazon. You got to go out and work hard for those, no matter who they are or where they come from. And Oregon picked up a couple commits on the offensive line, which does comfort me a little, John. These are not the most highly coveted prospects that you're going to find, but just from a numbers standpoint, the number of guys the Ducks are going to lose after this season on that offensive line dictates you got to just have bodies. And even if you're going after guys who are only going to become starters one day, one out of every 5 players, well, then go get 10 of them or something and just and work it out. So Bryce Boulton and Lipe Moala are the pair of 3-star offensive linemen that I'm referring to here. Let's start with Boulton and kind of what sort of player Oregon is getting there and what you see from him as a high school kid.
Yeah, these kids are opposites, right? I mean, with Boulton, you're talking about 6'3", 260 pounds, a guy who is very fluid, obviously longer and leaner as opposed to bulkier and more lower body dominant, a guy who is going to grow into his frame just a little bit here as time goes on. Doesn't play great competition week in, week out. So there's a lot down the line with this Boulton recruitment that I think we'll be talking about in a couple of years relative to the Oregon Ducks. But he's got this foundation, right? He moves incredibly well. He's ferocious at the point of contact. So you do get some dominance against that maybe lesser competition out in California outside of the SoCal area. So you do get a little bit more of that dominance, which you want to see when you question competition, right? You want the kid to stand out and it to be a no-brainer. And he's beating the running back in the hole on some of these reps. So there's a lot of movement, skill, and fluidity with Boulton that is certainly advantageous for an offensive lineman. And I think you move him to the interior down the line, maybe he can snap and he develops into a center who you can move down the line. But he's going to have to add weight. I mean, I think he knows that. Adrian Klemm certainly knows that. Dan Lanning, Kenny Dillingham, everybody involved knows that this is a bit of a long-term deal, but athletic foundation, and he's got kind of that natural tenacity that you want along the offensive line. So the technique and the size will come along here in the next 24 months or so. But like you said, you need bodies and you need guys on different timelines. So I think with a lot of these other prospects being bigger, more physical, ready to go, at least from a height and weight standpoint today, you need guys on the other side of that spectrum. So I do like this get for that purpose.
What about the other guy who is very much the opposite in the competition he's going up against in Lipe Moala, who plays for Mater Dei? In just as a general question for recruits who come out of that school, John, when you have so many highly touted prospects coming out of one school, in your time covering recruiting, which has been quite a while, certainly longer than I've been hosting the show, everybody. Is it possible to see guys get a little under recruited out of that school because other guys garner so much attention?
Absolutely. It's very easy to fall behind when you're talking about the best players in the country at their positions over the last few years, right? I mean, Mater Dei is, gosh, I mean, we do a whole show on the history of top prospects they've turned out there. Number one high school program in the country right now, based on the SB Live Sports Illustrated Power 25 poll. They just beat St. John Bosco, which is always kind of the measuring stick game. So we'll see, maybe a rematch there.
Which is where Mateo plays, by the way.
Right,
That's
exactly.
where Mateo plays, big time
Right.
players.
So, Mateo had a great game against Mater Dei, but Mater Dei got the dub. And look, this is a case where you could see why you don't want to call him a late bloomer, right? Because look, he's at Mater Dei. He started earlier in his career, but he blew out his ACL last year, right? So he missed his entire junior season, all critical. But then when you watch Mater Dei this year, there's only one 6'6", 340-pound kid out there, and that's the newest Oregon Duck verbal commitment. He's a very good tackle candidate. I do think there's a opportunity for him to either play the right side or inside, depending on what the rest of the O-line looks like, but he looks healthy. He's been standing out as a senior. He played really well against St. John Bosco. I think he's got great technique, and he looks healthy. You wouldn't otherwise have realized that he had an ACL last year. So I think that's what obviously stunted his recruitment. A lot of folks were wanting to see how he looked on the bounce back, and he's checked just about every box. And Duck fans got to love how he committed, right? He was a silent verbal commit to Adrian Klemm after a visit a couple weeks ago. And then on senior night at Mater Dei, he threw up the O when he was introduced as a senior, and that was his way of going public with the pledge. So pretty cool and obviously timely, right? We've been talking about the need for offensive linemen, and now you've got a prospect who physically is ready to go. He's only going to get stronger and more comfortable on that knee throughout his senior season, and obviously once he makes that transition into a Pac-12 weight room.
Yeah, 6'6", 330 compared to Boulton 6'3", 255. Just very different body types, right? And to me, I mean, it sounded like you were saying Moala could project as a tackle probably because of his height. Guards are typically a little stockier, a little more built out. But do you think that Moala is a guy who slots as a tackle, or is there a potential that he could slide inside and play guard?
I think there's some right tackle upside. I do know, first of all, there's so much talent, right, in that Oregon offensive line room that there's going to be some, no doubt or left tackle candidates among those underclassmen, mainly a guy named Josh Connolly. So I do think that sometimes dictates where you line up. And look, he's got experience at tackle already, and he's got the frame to play on that right side, right, the front side offensive tackle type prospect. He's got technique and polish, which is what you want. Not the most fluid compared to some of these other tackles we talk about, but he's so big, right? 6'6", 330 pounds, again, coming off of that ACL, and you can't miss him when you watch Mater Dei, which is one of the biggest compliments you can give to a Mater Dei or an IMG or a St. John Bosco player, right? Is because there's so many Power 5 and darn near NFL prospects on the field that if you stand out and command attention, it really does, complement, what you've become as a football player. So I do think there is some right tackle upside, but yeah, I think it's safer to peg him inside as a guy who's going to be a true dominant run blocker who plays with leverage and power at the point of contact.
And for any Oregon fans out there saying or thinking, frankly, what I've pointed out, which is these are not the most highly coveted prospects out there. The offensive line, I think in particular, John, is a position of development. Guys are willing to not play right away. They're willing to get in the weight room, work on their footwork, be committed to it because they're not getting the ball no matter what. So even though they may not play very much on game days, they're still going to practice and going through the same procedures, same drills as the other offensive linemen. And just so you have an understanding of where these guys can come from, TJ Bass, who to me looks like an NFL tackle or guard, he has been that good. The statistics back that up. He's been exceptionally good. Yeah, he was a 3-star recruit. Marcus Harper, who's filled in for Stephen Jones this year, admirably, might I add, on a dominant offensive line. He was also a 3-star recruit. So is it as exciting as a Josh Connolly who can come in and, be part of the jumbo package right away? Or if, God forbid, TJ Bass at left tackle goes down, you feel good about Connolly sliding in? No, but if you're willing to wait around and play the long game with these guys, you just shouldn't be surprised if their names pop up at somewhere down the line.
100%. That's that, like you said, it's about development at that position, really at every position, but you just don't see a whole lot of true freshman offensive linemen coming in and dominating across the country. You get them in spots, coaches or coaching staffs that are in transition or somebody gets hurt, as you mentioned earlier. Something like that could thrust a young guy into activity, but it's just not something we see every single year like we do at wide receiver and running back and pass rusher, where you can kind of just say, hey, come in and do this and get in the rotation and you'll be all right. It's not that simple along the offensive line, not only from a schematic and technical standpoint, but from a physicality and size standpoint. You're going against grown men week in, week out. So it's obviously understandable for that transition to be one of the slowest we get from high school to college. You got to be truly one of the rare, dancing bear type of offensive lineman to get on the field as a true freshman for one of these big time blue blood type programs. It's just not something we see every year.
And Josh Connolly is doing that. Panay Sewell did that, and that was kind of the last true freshman offensive tackle I think that was really out there, especially at left tackle for the Ducks. And yeah, well, look how that turned out. That's just how hard
Not
it
bad.
is.
Yeah.
But Oregon's now up to 20 verbal commitments class of 2023, and I still want more, Duck fans. I still want more. I also want John's thoughts on another one of those 20 verbal commits, but this time of year, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Go in there, post your job, put up the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are looking for someone to fill your job. Then simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn Jobs, the official recruiting sponsor here at the Locked On Network. So, John, one more verbal commit I want to ask you about, who I've kind of heard just like a few rumblings, just a little bit of buzz about, and it's Tatum Tuioti, who's a 3-star edge, one of several edge and defensive line commits in the class of 2023 for the Ducks. No surprise with Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy to see that as a priority, especially with all the linebackers they've already got either committed or on the roster who are young and project to be good players. Guys like Keith Brown, Harrison Taggart, Devin Jackson. I don't think I'm even naming all of them. Jeffrey Boss will be back next year and whatnot. There's a lot of depth at the linebacker slot. But Teitum Tuioti, a guy who, when he commits, you hear, well, he's the son of Tony Tuioti, so he's probably okay. He'll be all right. But what's your read on him as an edge prospect?
I like him. He's got a lot of polish, as you would expect, being a coach's kid, and that's all well and good, but that only gets you so far. This kid's got some explosiveness off the line of scrimmage, some first step ability that really puts pressure on an offensive tackle, and he's starting to fill out that frame a little bit more too, right? So, like you said, when you hear coach's kid, all that stuff, you're like, all right, well, he's going to be a developmental guy, a special teamer, right? You're going to throw all the monikers on top of him, but I do think rotationally, this is a kid, especially if he continues to fill out, who can see the field relatively early once he gets to a program like Oregon, because you can never have enough pass rushers. And again, the technique is great. The extension, he's got a great wingspan that I think he's listed at what? 6'4", 6'5". His wingspan is longer than that, so he could still be growing. So he's got this ability to extend and get off of blocks that really translates at every level of football. So I don't think this early in a tenure you throw out courtesy scholarship offers or anything like that if you're Dan Lanning. I mean, look where he came from, right? There ain't no courtesy out there, right? Stetson Bennett had to walk on at Georgia the first time. So there's no
He had to walk
courtesy
on like 3 times.
right. I
There
know
were
he's
like
like
3
40
different
years
times
old.
he kept coming back to him, and they kept saying no, and he kept insisting, "No, I'm going to make this work." And here we are.
Right. There's no courtesy coming into these big time college football situations from the high school ranks, especially. You're not going to just throw that out there, especially because you've got these connections. You probably are a little bit more able to walk on and go that route because you've got a little bit more resources at your disposal. So I think it said a lot for Oregon to go through with the scholarship process, the offering process, the commitment process. And you watch the tape, especially his updated senior stuff, and you're seeing dominance. You're seeing a lot of potential ability to see the field earlier than maybe we thought. He's not just a long technical pass rusher. He's got some twitch, he's got some explosion, and he's starting to get a little bit stronger in the upper body, which when you combine with that polish and that intellect, all of a sudden makes for a guy who could see the field and really stress out some of these offensive tackles.
Yeah, you have to figure a guy who grew up with his dad as a football coach knows the ins and outs of scheme and technique and fundamentals and such, or at least Oregon fans would hope. But based on what we've seen from the defensive line so far, I have no reason to suspect otherwise. Now, switching back to the offensive line here, John, a couple guys who we've talked about a good amount for the last few weeks. They've been in Oregon sites, Iapani, Laloulu, and Spencer Fano, a couple of four-star offensive linemen. Have you heard anything on the grapevine recruiting wise there? I saw something on 24/7 that indicated Laloulu might be committing to Oregon very soon. Kind of where are the Ducks at with those two guys?
Yeah, all the buzz that Arizona gathered in the offseason has totally shifted to Oregon at this point for Laloulu. He got to get back up to campus for that official visit earlier this month, as we previewed and talked about recently on your show. And by all indication, everything went incredibly well. He got the one-on-one time with Klemm. He obviously was able to see Big Bro in action against Arizona there, which again, ironically, is the other school that felt like it was in the ball game here. So that dominant of a win over that school, I think, only reemphasizes the potential of playing at Oregon versus Arizona for this kid. All the Hawaii connections that Klemm has, regarding this number one Hawaii prospect speaks for itself. On top of that, it really just feels like a matter of when and not if he's going to be a Duck. It's just for me, it's just does that date get set, and does someone else try to get in here? Does someone else see this potential? Look, Under Armour All American, all these great accolades that he has, blue chip recruit. Does someone else try to get in here late? And that's really the only thing to me that would offset this recruitment, because then he pushes the decision back, maybe takes a visit, and it's a bit of a wrinkle late in the game, like we'll talk about with Spencer Fano here in a second. But I don't see that. I don't see any visits that are locked in for him beyond that Oregon trip, and it looks like you said, he wants to get this thing done sooner rather than later, and that's great news for the Ducks, because this is a very different type of offensive lineman than the two that we talked about earlier, right? We talked about a developmental type, a right tackle, maybe swing prospect type. And this is your Mauler. This is just a totally different lower body dominant, total interior guy who really is the type you run behind down the line in the Pac-12 or maybe another conference, depending on how things shake out. So I do think that this is a very necessary get for the Ducks. I would venture to say the most important one remaining, now that you do have a true tackle candidate on board with modern day's finest. Now you need that true offsetter who can play inside earlier, and I think the Hawaiian fits that bill.
The other offensive lineman Oregon's going at has stiffer competition on the recruiting trail for the Ducks. You've got BYU with their hat in the ring. Utah has shown interest in Spencer Fano. Not that Arizona, who's a program on the rise, there's no other way to look at it in the Pac-12, but they're still building, and the trenches are kind of where they've struggled so far. Obviously, they beat out Oregon for T-Mac last year, and T-Mac is really, really, really good. He was torching Washington last week. We saw him beat Gonzo for a touchdown against the Ducks and had, I think, 85 receiving yards or so, which was the most of that potent wide receiver trio. But I digress. Going back to Fano here, the Ducks seems like have to work a little bit harder to keep him from going to either of the schools in Utah.
Yeah, and then there's new schools involved, right? Michigan got involved. They're going to get a visit. That was the big question mark we were curious about before. And then Clemson offered him. So now the Tigers are trying to work in a visit. So now all of a sudden, Fano had this top four of BYU, Utah, Oregon, Michigan, where we looked at Michigan as like, okay, puncher's chance, last visit, go for it kind of deal. Well, now Clemson all of a sudden jumps into that boat. So I think if they do get a visit, which he has an official visit left at his disposal that we thought he was going to use for BYU, maybe check out the local school one more time. Well, now all of a sudden, maybe Clemson takes that last visit because he's so familiar with BYU, in-state school, big brother on campus, all those things. BYU probably doesn't need an official to stay in the race for Spencer Fano. So now Clemson and or Michigan will be kind of the schools that you have to survive if he's going to now stay in that Pac-12 footprint. So this recruitment has become one of the more intriguing ones at the tackle position here late in the class of 2023. If and when he schedules that Clemson visit, my ears will certainly perk up because they're theoretically going to get the last one before he makes his public decision. So you wonder what that looks like all the way across the country. ACC football, very Christian mentality at Clemson. How does that work? There's so many interesting factors with that offer coming this late in the game, but obviously Fano has continued to look really darn good, right? He's the new age offensive tackle body type, 6'5", 275, longer, leaner, lighter on his feet. And a lot of programs have recognized that, even ones that traditionally don't look for that in Michigan, and those that are doing it at a very high level over the last decade in the Clemson Tigers. So that one becomes that much harder of a battle for Oregon to win, which is why I think the last couple offensive line commitments are that much more important for the Ducks to already have on board. Creates a little bit of insurance if Fano elects to pick one of these other schools.
Well, John, every time you talk about recruiting, our ears as Duck fans perk up. John Garcia Jr., the Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated. John, it is great to talk to you, as always, as the recruiting grind never stops, even as games continue. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.